Every place has a sound. Most of us just don't stop long enough to hear it. So, when I hiked 9 miles through the Spanish Pyrenees, climbing over 4,000 feet in elevation, I packed microphones instead of binoculars. I convinced a few friends to come along, although they had no idea I'd be stopping every few minutes to record my footsteps, hit rocks together, and point microphones at just about everything we passed. Most people come here to see the mountains. I came to listen to them. My hope was that if I collected enough sounds, I could build an instrument that sounded like this place. Not to recreate the Pyrenees, but to remember what it felt like to be here. So let's start at the beginning. Our hike began at Refugio de Viados, tucked deep within a natural park in the Spanish Pyrenees. Today it's a refuge for hikers and mountaineers. But long before people came here for adventure, these valleys were part of everyday life. For generations, shepherds brought their flocks through these mountains each summer, following the high pastures as the snow melted. Standing here, it's easy to think of these mountains as empty. But they've been shaping people's lives for centuries. And today they were about to shape mine too. There was only one thing left to do: start listening. Before I could start recording, I had to answer one question. What actually makes something sound like a drum? Every piece of a drum kit has its own job. A kick needs weight, a deep sound you don't just hear, you feel. A snare needs a sharp crack that cuts through everything else. Hi-hats are bright and crisp, keeping the groove moving. And cymbals are all about texture and sustain. So, somewhere on this mountain, I needed to find all of those sounds. At first, I recorded almost everything I could think of: the wind, the rivers, even the sound of the valley itself. It sounded beautiful, but beautiful doesn't always make a good drum sample. I needed sounds with more character. Then we reached our first stream crossing. As I stepped through the water, I noticed something I hadn't been paying attention to all day: my footsteps. So I stopped, clipped a microphone onto my hiking boot, and suddenly the entire mountain became an instrument. Loose gravel became bright, crunchy textures. A giant loose boulder had a completely different weight to it. Packed dirt was softer, almost like a brush on a snare. A fallen tree gave me this hollow wooden knock that I never would have thought to look for. And then we reached the snow. I'd never recorded footsteps on glacial snow before. Every step had this soft crunch that was completely different from the gravel just a few minutes earlier. The more we climbed, the more I've realized every surface had its own personality. I wasn't just hiking anymore, I was auditioning the mountain, one sound at a time. But there was still one sound I couldn't find. No matter what I recorded, nothing had the low-end push I needed for a kick drum. By this point, I had recorded a lot of sounds, but I still wasn't convinced I had a drum kit. The hardest part wasn't actually finding interesting sounds, it was finding them in complete silence. Every time I heard something I wanted to record, I had to stop, wait for everyone to get far enough ahead so I couldn't hear them talking, get out all of my equipment and camera, record for a few seconds, and then sprint to catch back up. After doing that over and over, I was definitely feeling the elevation. And even after climbing more than 4,000 feet, I was still missing the one sound I wanted most. I tried bigger rocks, different surfaces, anything that looked like it might have enough low end. Nothing really had that deep, punchy sound I was looking for. Eventually, we made it to the fourth lake. After hiking all that way, there was only one logical thing to do: jump in. I wasn't even thinking about drum samples anymore. I was just trying to cool off. But completely by accident, I recorded one of my favorite sounds of the entire trip. The funny part is, it didn't even come from a microphone. It came from the GoPro underwater. Listen. It sounded deep, muffled, almost like it belonged on a drum kit already. At that time, I had no idea if any of these recordings would actually work. I just knew I had a hard drive full of sounds, and a very long hike back down the mountain. Now it was time to head home. and find out if the Pyrenees could actually become a drum kit. Let's do this. I have hundreds of sounds here, so now it's time to pick the best ones and drag them into Ableton. I had over 100 recordings, but almost none of them actually sounded like drums. And that's because they weren't supposed to. My job wasn't to force these sounds into something they weren't. It was to figure out what they were already good at. Take this underwater recording, for example. On its own, it just sounds like, well, a GoPro underwater. But after pitching it down and layering it with one of my footsteps, it suddenly had the weight and punch I was looking for in a kick drum. Not because I turned it into a kick, but because I brought out the part that was already there. The snare ended up being my favorite to build. The rock already had the crack I was looking for, but it was still missing something. If you ever look underneath a real snare, there's actually a set of metal wires stretched across the bottom. When you hit the drum, those wires vibrate against the bottom head, creating that signature rattle that makes a snare sound like a snare. Obviously, the Pyrenees didn't come with a set of snare wires, so instead I layered in the sound of crickets. That constant high-frequency texture did a surprisingly good job of mimicking those vibrating wires. And then, just because I thought it sounded cool, I snuck in a splash recording. Not because it sounded like a snare, but because it gave the drum a little more character. Sometimes the sounds that make a sample interesting aren't the obvious ones. They're the tiny details your brain almost doesn't notice. The hi-hats were probably the easiest. The moment I heard my boots crunching across the gravel, I knew I had them. Every step was actually hundreds of tiny little impacts happening all at once, which is surprisingly close to what gives a real hi-hat all of its detail. After a little cleanup, the mountain slowly stopped sounding like a collection of recordings and started sounding like an instrument. So, after a 9-mile hike, over 4,000 feet of climbing, and hours of editing, there was only one question left. What does the Pyrenees actually sound like as a drum kit? Okay, so here's how everything sounds. If you enjoyed this one, I've got a lot more places to explore and a lot more sounds to discover. If you'd like to come along for the journey, I'd love to have you.